From the archives of the Midnight Society, we present a collection of recovered files. They come from the laptop and cloud storage of a freelance photographer named Daniel, who disappeared last year. His final blog post was an unfinished, frantic warning centered on a single object, an antique photo album. What you are about to hear is Daniel's story, a story that proves some photographs don't just capture a moment, they capture a soul. I found it buried under a pile of old postcards in a shop that smelled like dust and forgotten time. The album was magnificent. The leather was cracked and ancient, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. Our cherished faces, it read. I opened it, and my fascination turned to a kind of professional curiosity. The pages were filled with photos from the 20s, beautifully composed portraits of a single wealthy-looking family. But every single photograph had been vandalized. The faces, and only the faces, had been cut out with a surgeon's precision, leaving behind these ghostly, headless figures. It was the creepiest, most compelling thing I had ever seen. I thought it was a brilliant, macabre art project. I bought it for next to nothing. The shop owner seemed relieved to be rid of it. I took it back to my studio, convinced I had found the inspiration for my next big project. I had no idea that inspiration was a predatory thing, and that I had just brought it home to feed. I showed the album to my best friend Sarah that afternoon. She was my go-to model, the most expressive face I knew. She thought it was as creepy and fascinating as I did. Who would do this? She asked, tracing the empty space where a child's face should have been. That's when I had the idea, a new portrait series. I would take new photos of new people and fill the empty slots. A project about replacing the past, about creating new faces to fill the void. It felt profound, artistic. Sarah, of course, loved the idea and immediately volunteered to be the first subject. She was always my greatest supporter. We agreed to shoot the next day. We were both so excited, so full of creative energy. We were just two artists, playing with a strange old book. We were innocently laying a trap for her, and I was the one holding the bait. We had no idea we were actually loading a weapon that had been dormant for a century. The photo shoot was perfect. Sarah was a natural, as always. We took hundreds of shots, but one of them was magic. It captured her perfectly. That warm, open smile, the spark of life in her blue eyes. It was one of the best portraits I had ever taken. That evening, I printed it out on high-quality archival paper. I carefully trimmed it to size. The newness of the photograph, a stark contrast to the age of the book. I went to the first empty slot in the album, a portrait of a woman in a long, elegant dress, her face a perfect empty oval. With a sense of artistic satisfaction, I slid my photograph of Sarah into the ancient paper slots. It fit perfectly. It felt right, like I was healing a small piece of this strange, broken object. I closed the heavy burgundy leather cover, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The project had begun. I had filled the first empty space. I didn't realize I had just locked my best friend into a cage, and the album was the key. A few days later, Sarah came by for another shoot. We were trying out a different lighting setup. As I was reviewing the photos on my camera, I felt a strange sense of disconnect. Something was off. I kept toggling back to the photos from the first shoot. In the new pictures, Sarah's face seemed different, subtly so. The curve of her jaw was a little sharper, the bridge of her nose a fraction narrower. I shook my head, blaming myself. The lighting, I mumbled. I'm using a harder key light. It's changing the shadows on her face. Sarah just laughed, not noticing anything different at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I was a photographer. I had spent years studying faces, studying light, the minute details that make a person who they are. And the face I was seeing on my camera screen was not quite the same face I had photographed 3 days ago. It was a subtle echo, a minor chord in a familiar song, but I could hear it, and it was deeply, deeply unsettling. That night, I couldn't let it go. I pulled the photos from both shoots into my editing software and put them side by side. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the light. It wasn't the angle. Her face had changed. The changes were minuscule, the kind of thing you would never notice in passing. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a subtle shift in the shape of her lips. Her jawline was definitively sharper. It was her face, but it was also not. It was like a flawless, expert forgery that was slowly, methodically erasing the original. I felt a wave of nausea. I wasn't just taking her picture. I was a participant in some kind of slow, horrifying theft of identity. I closed the laptop, the darkness of my studio suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating. The old burgundy leather album was sitting on my bookshelf, and for the first time, it didn't look like an art project. It looked like a predator, silently digesting its first meal. I had to see it for myself. Outside the controlled environment of my studio, I called Sarah and asked her to meet me for coffee, my voice strained with a fake casualness. When she walked into the cafe, I felt a jolt of ice in my veins. It was worse in person. The changes were more pronounced in the real world. Her face, which I knew as well as my own, was now a beautiful, terrifying forgery. The warmth in her smile was still there, but it was sitting on a slightly different structure. Her bright, expressive blue eyes seemed to be looking out from a face that was no longer entirely hers. She talked about her week, about a funny thing her cat did, and all I could do was stare, mapping the subtle alien geometry of her features. She was my best friend, and she was being stolen from the inside out, right in front of me, and she had no idea. The next day, I didn't call Sarah. I couldn't. Instead, I went back to the source, the album. I opened the heavy burgundy leather cover and looked at the photo I had taken, the one of the real Sarah, now nestled in the first slot. Then I looked at the next empty slot. It was a portrait of a man, his face also expertly cut away, leaving a headless figure in a sharp 1920s suit. I felt a cold academic curiosity rise above my fear. Was it the slot or the photograph? I printed out a landscape photo I had taken last year, a beautiful empty shot of a windswept cliff over the ocean. It was a picture with no people, no faces. I carefully trimmed it and slid it into the man's empty slot. I closed the book. It was a test, a control for my experiment. If nothing happened to the landscape photo, then the curse was tied to the act of photographing a person. If something did happen, I didn't let myself finish the thought. I woke up the next morning after a night of dreamless, terrified sleep. I went straight to the album, my hands trembling. I opened it to the page with the landscape photo. My heart stopped. The photo had changed. It was no longer empty. Standing on the edge of the cliff in my photograph was a man, a tall, gaunt man in a dark, high-collared suit, his features indistinct in the distance. He was just standing there, a new impossible figure that had been born from the album's emptiness. And then I saw the other change. I flipped back a page to Sarah's portrait. The photo was still of her, but the face, it had changed again. It was even sharper now, less like her, more like a stranger, and on the page next to her photo, a single spidery word had appeared, written in what looked like faded brown ink. I knew then that I had to find out who had owned this album. Who was the original photographer? Who was this collector? I went back to the antique shop. The old man was there, sweeping dust from one corner to another. I put the album on the counter, my voice shaking. Who was Theodore Ashe? I asked. The old man froze, the broom still in his hands. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient pity. How do you know that name, son? He whispered. His name was Theodore Ashe, a portrait photographer from the 20s, a brilliant artist. They say his camera didn't just capture your likeness. They say it captured your availability. Before I could ask what that meant, he pointed a trembling finger to a dusty framed photograph on the wall behind him. It was a portrait of the photographer himself. The photograph was old, the black and white faded to sepia. It showed a man standing next to a large antique bellows camera on a tripod, and my blood turned to absolute ice. He was a gaunt, severe-looking man with slicked-back dark hair and cold, possessive dark eyes that stared directly through the camera, as if he could see me here, a century later. It was the same man. It was the exact same man who was now standing on the cliff in my landscape photograph inside the album. The photographer wasn't dead. He wasn't a ghost. He was the album. He was a predator who lived inside the empty spaces, inside the paper and the leather and the glue. And he was hunting, not for new photos. He was hunting for new faces to complete his collection. And he had almost finished tailoring Sarah's to fit his needs, to match the empty slot of his long-dead wife. I ran back to my studio, my mind a whirlwind of terror. The word almost burned in my memory. He was close to finishing. I had to get her picture out. I burst into the studio and grabbed the album. I found Sarah's page, my fingers fumbling as I tried to slide the photograph out of the tight paper slots. But it wouldn't move. It was stuck fast, as if it had been glued to the page. I pulled harder, a ragged sob escaping my lips. The corner of the photograph tore, and I saw with horror that underneath there was no black paper. There was a milky, gray, skin-like substance that seemed to have grown from the album, fusing with the back of her picture. It wasn't just holding the photo. It was consuming it. It was making her a part of the book itself. The album was no longer a collection of memories. It was a collection of people. My phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice on the other end was flat, monotone, devoid of the warmth I had known my entire life. "He wants to see me, Daniel," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "Theodore, he says the family is all waiting. He says my face is finally ready. It's so lovely to finally have a place, to finally fit." I screamed into the phone for her to stay away, to run, but the line went dead. I looked down at the album in my hands. I flipped back to her page. The word almost was gone. In its place, in the same spidery brown ink, was a new word, perfect. And the photograph, her face, it was no longer her. It was a pale, placid, doll-like face, a perfect match for the ghostly 1920s aesthetic of the album. The last spark of my Sarah was gone. The face taker had finished his work. I was broken. I had led my best friend to this predator. I had been his brush, his tool. I sat in my studio for hours, the silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. Then I heard a faint scratching sound. I looked at the album on the table. It had fallen open to a new page, a new empty slot, a headless portrait of a man in a simple dark shirt, a man who looked roughly my height, my build. And as I watched, a new word appeared on the black paper, next to the empty space, written in that same terrible faded ink. It was my name, Daniel. It wasn't a statement, it was a label. The album was finished with Sarah. His family was complete. And now, the collector, Theodore Ash, was ready to start a new album, and he had just chosen his first subject. I knew I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let him take me, or anyone else, ever again. I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be the curator of this curse. I went to my dark room, the red light casting my studio in a hellish glow. I found the one thing that could fight a monster made of images. Developer fluid, fixer, chemicals that could burn and erase. I put on a pair of thick rubber gloves and a respirator mask. I took the album, the source of all this horror, and I opened it one last time, looking at the pale, stolen face of the woman who used to be my best friend. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I whispered. Then I took the first bottle of photographic acid, and I began to pour. Daniel's final, unfinished blog post ended there. When police entered his studio, they found it empty. The air was thick with the smell of corrosive chemicals. In the center of the floor was a bubbling, ruined mass of what looked like leather and melted paper. But as they sifted through the wreckage, they found one thing that had survived: completely untouched by the acid. A single perfect photograph of a gaunt, severe-looking man from the 1920s, staring back at them with cold, possessive eyes. The case of Daniel's disappearance remains open, but we at the archives believe he succeeded. He destroyed the collection, but in doing so he released the collector, and a predator like Theodore Ashe will always eventually find a new camera.